I've got the thumbs up, so hello, welcome. I have to say, even in the darkest of times, and it feels like we're in one of the darker of times, it's still quite tremendous to be here because it's been a long time. This is a very special year, as we all know. I think we're going to talk more about that this evening and throughout the day, but it's been an incredible run. And Robin Niblett, our director, founded and created and has not only led Chatham House for many years, but he also created the London conference, and it's nice to have it back while you are leading us. So it's great. For me personally, just seeing people, there's no, I know it sounds trite and we say it all the time, but I deeply mean it. There's no greater joy than seeing all of you in person. This is an extraordinary panel. I was trying to count, and there, I think, are more than 35 books written, a single author, few of them, the minority of them edited on this panel. So be careful what you ask. You might get a lot coming back at you. I would say that it's an all-women's panel with a token man, but Timothy Garton has more than 10 books and is one of the world's leading public intellectuals, so I think there's no tokenism on this panel. Tomorrow marks the 4-month point since Russia invaded Ukraine. We were told for quite a long time by President Biden that this would happen. Not all of us believed it. I think we more than believe it now, and we're very much, I think, with some differences of opinion on where we go, very much in it together, which I guess in many ways is the data point that inspired those of us, or those of my colleagues, I can't claim any responsibility, who set the agenda. Can the US and Europe hold together? But it was just over 10 months ago that the United States and the United Kingdom, NATO, withdrew from Afghanistan, and things looked quite a lot different. For those of us French on the panel, Christine, it was, I think, around 9 months ago that the AUKUS partnership was announced, unbeknownst to France, I guess. And there's a much longer and more difficult history. So that, perhaps can Europe and the US hang together, is something that we should think about with a bit of longevity, both looking backwards and looking forward. It's hard to think of a better person to do that and to begin. And I'll say just a very brief word about each of you, and then turn first to Timothy Garton Ash, who gave the most brilliant summation of Germany and Russia and Europe at the ECFR conferences recently. I highly recommend that you watch it. 5 minutes on that entire 30-year history, so we expect no less at our London conference. Timothy Garton Ash, Professor of European Studies at University Oxford, and so many other things, 10 books at least. The most recently, Free Speech, 10 Principles for a Connected World, incredibly important. Claudia, and then Christine Ockrent, commentator, writer, producer, leading public intellectual in France. You shape the debate and you lead the conversation in France in a very probing way, and it's tremendously good to have you here. Claudia Major, head of the International Security Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, has written extensively on international security, European security, NATO, and I would say especially since that 4-month mark has really helped us understand Germany and how significant and how durable this change is likely to be. And Kori, well known to everybody in London. This is one of the saddest days for me, was when you left and returned to Washington. Good for Washington, bad for London. Is currently Senior Fellow, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Used to be the #2 at the other think tank in London. We're very inclusive at Chatham House, and we have the ability to be inclusive because we have a great perch created by Robin. Kori's written many books, and the one that I like to refer to is pinned on her Twitter feed, Safe Passage, The Transition from British to American Hegemony, a safe passage. Can we do it again? And I think we need to be able to do that. So without any further ado, we're on the record. Please tweet. Timothy Garton Ash, can the US and Europe hold together? And is it the right way to ask the question?
Thank you very much, Leslie. This is, of course, a hardy perennial of a question. It's a question that's been asked for 80 years, ever since the Transatlantic Geopolitical West came into existence when the United States entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor. But for the first 50 years, ultimately, however big the transatlantic rows, we were pulled back together again by a common enemy, first Hitler's Germany, then the Soviet Union. Since the end of the Cold War, there has been a structural question about whether the basic threat perceptions of Europe and the United States, for example, in relation to China, will diverge. So in the big transatlantic row over the Iraq War, I remember Lord Carrington murmuring to me, if only we had Brezhnev back. That pulled us all together again. So I wouldn't get carried away by this moment of great transatlantic unity because the structural question, I think, is still posed. That's point number one. Point number two, for the next year, in my view, the biggest question is not will Europe and the US hang together. It is will both Europe and the US hang in there and do what it takes to enable Ukraine to defend its territory and drive out Vladimir Putin's invasion army. Yeah. Because while the Ukrainians have shown the will and skill to defend their country, what they need, what may be a long war, it may be another year, they need a hell of a lot of weapons, ammunition, and a lot of money to sustain the economy. Some estimates are $5 to $7 billion a month. And I worry very much that as the cost of living crisis segues into train strikes next door, into maybe a Eurozone crisis in relation to Italy, gas prices affecting the midterms in the US, possibly a refugee crisis because of the impact of the lacking Ukrainian and Russian grain, and so on and so forth, our will to hang in there for the long haul will fail. There are already signs for that on both sides of the Atlantic, and that would be an enormous victory for Vladimir Putin over the West. And to go back to the first panel and Gideon Rachman's comment, it would be a blow to global order also in Asia. So that's point number two. It's not so much hanging together as, in my view, hanging in there for the next year. Final point. Of course, the Chatham House conference is by far the most important international meeting anywhere in the world for the next 2 days. That's absolutely clear. But there is another little meeting going on in Brussels. And if, as I trust, the EU 27 actually decide to accept candidacy for Ukraine and Moldova and open negotiations for Albania and North Macedonia, equally important in my view, and if that actually becomes a strategic commitment to a new big Eastern enlargement of the EU, and that's a very big if, but if that happens, this also opens up a new perspective for transatlantic relations in which the US remains the security backbone for Europe through NATO, with the Europeans doing more, but Europe, particularly the EU, does much more for the social, economic, and political consolidation of Europe's eastern neighborhood. And that's a new division of labor, which I think is an offer to the United States. And in the long run, to take the question that was put to David Lammy about Russia, in the long run, if we succeed in that, what that means is that one day Russia has to face up to the point that it has lost an empire and maybe has to start finding a role. Although, as Britain shows, that can take a long time.
Thank you. Christine, we'll come to you next. It's expensive, staying the course. People are now saying it's costing $5 to $7 billion a month to sort of keep Ukraine going. What is your reaction to this question? Can the US and Europe, and remember, it's European allies, it's not the European Union, this includes the UK very much. Can the US and Europe hang together?
Well, I'm glad that the UK is, this morning at least, very much associated with the EU. But maybe I should start with, if you forgive me, before answering your question, with trying, and I know it's going to be hard, but to dismiss the traditional view of France having this very peculiar attitude because of its Gallic, Gaullist tradition of being quite openly hostile to American leadership, very enthusiastic about Germany as long as Paris believes Paris leads, and extremely suspicious of anything English except Winston Churchill. So, that being said, when it comes to French policies about Ukraine and about NATO, we have re-elected a French president, Emmanuel Macron, who is actually a very pro-European Frenchman. And that doesn't happen, you know, that many often at the top of our political system. And during his first term, and I'm pretty sure it will be the same in this term, however more complicated the political situation has become in Parliament, Macron's will to indeed promote and accelerate European integration has been a factor in the EU. I think the French leadership of the European Council, you know, that rotating system, which is about to last in a couple of days, has proved so, and especially on Ukraine membership, which is about to become at least the status of an official candidate for Ukraine and Moldova, will become official probably today or tomorrow, in spite of French traditional unease about enlargement, which historically had always been seen as a British plot to prevent the EU to go deepen into integration. Now, of course, you know, Macron has a tendency to go into what we call la pensée complexe, which is an elegant way to describe our national inclination to use too many words to save little concrete things. But he has forged these concepts about European sovereignty, about strategic autonomy, and of course the fact that in a terrible lack of, which was very surprising to many of us, very bad wording and even worse timing, he would insist on maintaining a dialogue with Vladimir Putin and talking about not humiliating Russia. I mean, that obviously has, how could I put it politely? It has tarnished, I think, French reputation and Macron's reputation, almost to an excessive extent, because as far as Ukraine goes, the French support is total. The French delivery of weapons, starting with what we have best in the shop, the Canon César. We probably deliver more weapons than is actually officially advocated, but we don't have that much. You know, we're stuck in stock, so to speak, and you know, France was indeed involved in these wars in Africa for quite some time. But the support is there. Now, when it comes to NATO and EU, the cohesion has been remarkable so far. And I think that for obvious reasons, Ukraine has come as a reality shock to Macron and to the French way of looking at NATO, because obviously European defense can only be seen as part of the Atlantic Alliance, an European pillar. It's interesting that Jens Stoltenberg was at the Élysée the day before yesterday. Macron wanted to know what the new strategic compass, which will be discussed in Madrid in a few days, will deal with. There is indeed a French intention to insist that within NATO, with a stronger European pillar, more European efforts on defense, and I'm sure Claudia will develop that better than I can, it is still necessary for Europe to have its own priorities, especially if, and that was very much discussed this morning, in a very interesting fashion, this idea of a shift, that NATO would sort of include Indo-Pacific or, you know, South Asia concerns and stakes. So to try and summarize, I think that France is very much into Europe and very much into the idea that European defense has to be indeed developed, but within the Atlantic framework, and at least that's what I gather from the most recent conversations I was able to have.
Thank you. Claudia, you have said, and I'm sure have a lot to say on this question, your responses, but also your own view on this basic question. Can the US and Europe hold, and where is Germany going in this?
I was like, thank you. Thank you first, and it's always nice to be on that, particularly on that panel, and being back in London. I'm very much tempted to actually answer Christine and Tim and take up some of those points, but I try to behave. That's maybe my German inclination to answer your question.
Don't behave too much.
Which I didn't, I know. You know, the French are terrible.
I think my first very short answer would be, I don't know. And the second, a bit longer answer is to say, can we afford not to hang together from a European perspective? And I think we cannot afford it, at least not in the security and the defense realm. And the third element would be to say, are we talking about what we like to see or what is likely to happen? So we have this normative idea, of course we have to stick together, but it looks a bit differently in reality. Maybe kind of two bigger points. If you look at the current war in Ukraine, it's pretty clear that it has given unity and purpose, again, to not only the transatlantic relationship, but also to what I would call a normative concept of the West. So the West not as a geographic idea, but as a normative idea of all those states who buy into a certain amount of principles like freedom, rule of law, and all that. And then it's not geographic, but it comprises countries like New Zealand or Australia who also participate in the sanctions. So the West, not geographic, but the West is a normative concept. So the war has united the transatlantic community, the West, and we look good in the moment. We look strong and united. So there is a new dynamic, and as you all know, having an external problem usually helps to keep the house together. It forges unity. And it helps to put aside all those nasty topics which we don't like. All divisions like burden sharing, defense spending. I'm German, I know what I'm talking about with defense spending. Pivot to Asia, European sovereignty, strategic autonomy, however you want to call it. Democratic backsliding in Hungary and Poland. We all put that aside and said, all we together concentrate on Ukraine. I'm very skeptical how long this is going to last. If we remember 2014, the annexation of Crimea, we had the same unity effect in 2014. But when the war stopped and transformed into a conflict, so an escalation below the level, the threshold of war, Ukraine wasn't in peace since 2014. Ukraine was on a permanent conflict with Russia in the information space, in the economic space, in the military space, but it wasn't an open war. So, but as soon as this calmed down a little bit, it was taken as a new normality and the unity was fading away. And if I might say, and then came Trump, and you know what happened. This current war, this current conflict is likely to stay for a very, very, very long time. So your argument might go, but this war is bigger than 2014. It includes a nuclear dimension with open nuclear saber rattling from Russia. But sociology tells us that we cannot focus on a problem for a very long time. And we already see in many European countries a war fatigue. And old topics are coming back, like the economic questions. What I find particularly interesting on this thinking how long we are going to stay united is that for Europeans, for many European countries, this current war in Ukraine is existential. And even for those countries who don't feel existentially threatened, they do realize that something has fundamentally changed. The German Chancellor said on his famous speech on 27th of February, we woke up in a different world. So even if you don't feel like this is about you, you feel something has really fundamentally changed. To put it in simplistic terms, we moved from a peace order, which we had in Europe since the end of the Cold War, into a conflict order in Europe with Russia in a long-term perspective. So for us, and I'm simplifying again, everything has changed in Europe. From a US perspective, something has changed. But many things stayed as they used to be. So there is an asymmetry to the extent this war is hitting us. And this is why I'm saying, yes, this war has given us unity and purpose, but the structural things, and this is what Tim earlier said, have not changed. Gideon said that in an earlier session. The great power competition is still there. The focus on China, the US focus on China is not changing. And it has been even confirmed after the war. For those who are defense nerds, you might have seen the national defense strategy of the US with 4 priorities. And the first 3 are about China. So this hasn't changed. So all signs still tell us that China is going to be the main priority. And only if security in Europe is tremendously getting worse, if Russia would move beyond Ukraine, this might change. Fingers crossed, it doesn't. So we can talk about unpredictability. I don't know how this is going to develop in the transatlantic context. But if we are really honest, this is just hiding away of what we actually know. Who would disagree in that room that European security and defense will matter less for the US? I think probably nobody. So I think we have a predictability which we don't like to see, that the relationship between the US and Europe is going to remain strong. We will team up together against China, but in security and defense, it will be less important. But that's not a nice perspective, because all talk about European sovereignty, to which I'm totally subscribe, is a long-term perspective. Any capability hole the Americans are going to leave in the defense sphere, it takes us Europeans 10 to 15 or 20 years to fill in, and I don't even talk about the nuclear. So I think to finish, we have a selective perception of what we like to see, and we are very much tempted to take it as a nice pattern for the future. We now look at us and like, wow, this is so united, this works so perfectly in Europe and with the US. And we think this is a new nice pattern. You mentioned Afghanistan, the withdrawal from Afghanistan. You mentioned AUKUS. Why is not that the next pattern, where Europeans' position were not taken into account in the US, where we were disunited, and Europeans were tremendously and terribly poor in the way they reacted. So what is a new pattern? Is this the nice one we are having in the moment, or is this the one we had with Afghanistan? But I don't want to finish on that pessimistic note. So if we look in a long-term perspective, and we hope that this war at some point will stop, and we will even succeed in managing the conflict that comes afterwards, the conflict in all areas, there will hopefully be a green Marshall Plan for Ukraine. And this is again where Europeans and Americans could join up and cooperate again.
That would be very expensive. And I think what the UK is at 9.1% inflation. The United States has raised interest rates. I was in New York last week. I went into Bloomberg, and the lead presenter said, oh, nobody's talking about Ukraine anymore. You're going to talk about Ukraine? Kori, I mean, you're in the belly of the beast. You're in Washington. You see it from multiple angles because you spend a lot of your time in Europe, and you think about China and the big security and defense issues. Is this, a sort of temporary moment of transatlantic unity? How durable is it? And especially, what should we look out for? What's likely to change that could drive the relationship in one direction or another?
So I'm a lot more optimistic than Claudia is. I think because we took a set of decisions together as a transatlantic community at a time we thought Russia was going to win the war in Ukraine and win it fast. And we nonetheless squared our shoulders and did the hard stuff together. And I think that's consequential. It will make it harder to defect from common policy as the costs go up. And of course, the costs are going up domestically for everybody. And it's going to be hard. It's going to require leadership by everybody in the transatlantic community, and not just by all of our governments. But, you know, the US isn't about to make China the priority. We have made China the priority. And nonetheless, when Russia attacked Ukraine, the United States flowed an airborne division to Europe. The United States voted for $40 billion in assistance to Ukraine. We are dumping weapons on Ukraine as fast as we can train them for it. And, you know, in November, the Biden administration said, you know, we have to be incredibly careful. We can't send weapons to Ukraine. By January, they said, we can't send offensive weapons to Ukraine. By May, they said, well, we're going to send weapons that can range Russian territory, but the Ukrainians promise they're not going to use them that way, right? That's a toboggan ride towards much deeper commitment. And I think what we know in the political science literature about free societies is that they're very slow to mobilize, but more durable in commitments because you have to win the domestic political argument. And you know, I saw a poll last week. 94% of Americans have a deeply negative view of Vladimir Putin. And the 6% who don't are basically our disgraced former president and the people immediately around him. So you don't get 96% of Americans on one side for anything. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine has crystallized the attitude. I mean, I see Lord Robertson of Port Ellen here, and when he was NATO Secretary General, we kept trying to persuade the Russians to take a vision of European security that was mutually beneficial, in which good outcomes for them were also good outcomes for others. And we have failed to draw Russia into that perspective. And now, something that came out of the last panel, which is we can either deal with the consequences, refugees, global food shortages, or we can actually deal with the causes of it, which is Russian aggression in Ukraine. And I think I am more confident, I think, than the other folks on the panel that the clarity that Russia is imposing on us about who they are and what they want, and how deleterious it will be to the European order and the international order that made all of us safe and prosperous, is going to cause us to hang together, squabble as we always do, and yet the clarity that Russia has forced on us will make it very hard to defect from common policies.
I'm going to come right back to you, and then to our European colleagues on the panel. I know that you're not always all on the same page. On the, you know, the big, it's not even the elephant in the room because everybody talks about it. There's no poking around to see what it is. There are midterms in the United States coming up. There's a, 2024 presidential election across the United Kingdom, across Europe. Everybody. I think people here seem to believe that Trump is more likely to come back than people in the United States do. This is, what I hear. And people think that this means something radically different coming out of the United States. So, you're watching the January 6th hearings. You are listening to all different arms of your party, the Republican Party. I know that you're a never Trump Republican. And have served in many Republican administrations and sort of know this from the inside out. Do international relations, do transatlantic relations just kind of carry on if there is a very big change in November and then again in 2 more years? Or, what should Europe expect to see, and what does it mean for the United, 'cause, this is really a fundamental question. There's no glossing over it. If we have another January 6th, if we have another, never mind Donald Trump, but something like this, it's a whole different universe. I mean, I think many people here believe that we're suddenly in a whole different universe, and we better start planning for it. So is that your view, or do you think that more or less, the polity holds and the transatlantic
So I
relationship
think
holds?
America's friends and allies are always right to be worried about us, right? I mean, my favorite description of Americans comes from the historian Bertha Ann Reuter in 1923, who wrote, "Americans are a people so extreme in politics or religion or both that they could not live in peace anywhere else." And we have a political system structured to tie our leadership very tightly to public attitudes. That's why you get such wide pendular swings in American politics, because the House of Representatives gets elected every 2 years. Political parties have less control over their candidates. I mean, the United States is a country where any idiot can get elected president, and very often does.
We are on the record.
But I don't mean to trivialize the nature of challenge that Donald Trump and his supporters pose to democracy in America. What the January 6th hearings are making quite clear is that this was an organized effort to have a coup, an anti-democratic coup in the United States. And they would have very much liked to organize violence against the Vice President of the United States and members of Congress in order to be able to hold on to power. Where I think America's friends should take solace is it failed for lots of reasons, and those lots of reasons have to do with the institutional strengths of the United States. Right? You do have hearings going on in Congress. You do have the Justice Department prosecuting over 700 cases against insurrectionists from January 6th. Sunlight continues to be the best disinfectant in American politics, and we are seeing it work. We're in the middle of a big dogfight on the right about the nature of conservatism in the United States. And there's no substitute for winning that argument. We just got to fight it through. But I think the evidence that the fight is engaged, and actually that the forces of moderation are making significant progress. I would point out that not only was the governor of Georgia, who insisted on the integrity of the election over Donald Trump's efforts, and the Secretary of State of Georgia were both just reelected. The governor of Alabama, one of the reddest states in the union, is running for the presidential nomination on an anti-Trump platform. You actually also even begin to see signs of cross-party cooperation in the Congress. You got a bipartisan gun control bill passed. I noticed on a bipartisan basis, Congress just added $47 billion to the defense budget's top line for the coming year. So I think what we begin to see is transparency, assisting the progress of anti-Trump forces both on the right, and cooperative instincts among Americans on the left in order to inoculate against a second Trump election.
Timothy Garton Nash.
But we got work to do.
Timothy Garton Nash, America has always been a very parochial country. It's also always been a very internationalist country. It has strands of isolationism. Kori has sort of, mapped out the struggle and the fight, and perhaps, the bright points. And we know that alongside each of those primaries that she's noted, there are other primaries that look far less good from the point of view of facts, science, information, rule of law, and we know that a lot of people still believe in the big lie. So if Donald Trump or one of his followers come back into power, if the Republicans take the House, which everybody believes they will, if they take the Senate, which some people believe they will, what does it mean for Europe? Does Europe sort of come together, keep the US, in the foreign policy elite, continue, in the United States to stay with the Europeans on questions of Russia? Or, how does this map out, not only on Russia and Ukraine, but, in the next 2 years, what does it mean for Britain, right? What does it mean for Britain's relationship with the United States and Britain's relationship with Europe?
So I think it is already concentrating European minds, in which I include British minds in this case, the possibility that Trump or a Trumpoid president might come back. And I think, to take it to something that Christine said, I think the crucial difference in my mind is between strategic autonomy, i.e. an implicitly Euro-Gaullist idea of building up our independence from the United States, and European sovereignty, by which Macron really means European power. I am very much in favor of l'Europe puissance, European power. And I think we are understanding on both sides of the channel, in Europe as a whole, the need to build up European power, firstly for ourselves, given Putin's aggression in Ukraine, but secondly, in the prospect that we might be able to rely less upon the United States. So to sum up, I think it's very good for us to fear like hell that Trump might win in 2024, just as long as he doesn't.
Christine, your response to this, and also what it means for France, but also for transatlantic relations. And also, what is the conversation, I guess, within France about this particular question?
Well, the conversation right now is, how are we going to manage the fact that France has become a parliamentary democracy like any other one on the European continent? And, we don't like to be like others, so to speak. Anyway, all jokes apart, I fully subscribe to Tim's distinction. And I think, again, it's a question of timing, because it's very short term, the danger of Trump or DeSantis, another, allow me, crazy American, to get to the White House. It's very short term for us. And any defense planning, and indeed we pay that cost with the Ukrainian war, takes a very long time. So I think the discrepancy between those timetables really puts more legitimacy to Macron's obsession with building up European defense. Now, of course, when it comes to Germany buying F-15 American planes, then, the French sort of say, well, that's not really what should be done. But I think more seriously, we have to plan long term, whatever happens in the US. And of course, we all pray that Trump or any other guy like him makes it. But as Kori said, anything is possible in America. So what will be important as far as the EU is concerned, once the emotion erodes, once, the war fatigue, inflation, social issues in each of our countries, and indeed even here, as we can see, I think that will make European unity on these long-term goals even more important, whatever happens on the American scene. And
Claudia.
We need the UK to be part of that. And the French, as you know, are very much for reviving the Lancaster House agreements, because obviously the UK and France being the two nuclear powers in Europe and within NATO, it's vital that indeed And so I won't say anything about Boris Johnson at this stage.
Very good.
I'm going to come to Claudia, and then I will come to the audience, so please sort of prepare your questions. I can see hands already. Claudia.
Three very brief points. The first is, very honestly, I don't care whether we talk about European sovereignty, about strategic autonomy, about strategic sovereignty, as it is in the German government program. I think the wording has become totally toxic in Europe, and in the US, by the way. So at the core of all those fancy concepts, we always have the capacity to act. And then it's not doesn't sound as nice as European sovereignty, obviously. But maybe it allows us to get over the toxic debates we had in the past. And if we talk about capacity to act, I find it actually a little bit insulting for the Europeans to say we have to react to an American disengagement. Of course, that's an enormous danger, and I see it. And I obviously support European efforts to do that. But for me, the real motivation or the real incentive for the Europeans should be to say we have something in Europe which we want to protect. And we should be ashamed that we as Europeans, independently whether you are in the EU or outside, we are in the moment not militarily able to defend ourselves without the US. Full stop. And that has been going on for many years. And we have been talking about sovereignty, strategy, whatever you want to call it. So the key point for me is not, oh, should we prepare? Of course we should. But shouldn't we have the own ambition to be able to do that? And be like, oh my God, we haven't done that for decades. So second point, if we are honest, and I'm only talking about the defense sphere, gaining that capacity to act takes decades. Christine said that. If you look at the Americans having, in the European defense realm, they are the political leader. Who can replace this political leadership the US is playing in Europe, in NATO? This kindly twisting the arms of their allies so they decide in the right way. How can we replace the conventional contribution of the US? In many NATO plans, the US is still doing half of it. If we want to fill that holes, again, it takes us a decade. And we haven't talked about the nuclear dimension. Where we would really need to rethink if the Americans were to disengage. So, give you a very, very tangible example. In 2017, France and Germany launched the Future Combat Air System. That's a competition thingy to Tempest that the Brits launched. 2017, it has been launched. If it's ever going to fly, this is going to be in 2040 or 2045. So if Europe wants to have its own capacity to act, this is going to take much longer than 2024 when the Americans are going to vote. So get ready for this long-term perspective. Last and final point. When do we, I mean, as I said, those who can remember the Saint-Malo agreements on European defense, there was this famous sentences, Europe should have the autonomous capacity to act, the capabilities to do so, and the will to do so, something in the lines of that. So in 1998, we talked about strategic autonomy. What has happened since? So the question for me is, are we able to act without a crisis? Or do we need a war and a crisis to act? Since the Ukrainian war, we have three interesting things in Europe. Finland and Sweden moving to NATO, having debated that for decades. Equally interesting, but not so often mentioned, is Denmark. Denmark had an opt-out of EU defense, and they decided to come back to the European Union. And finally, my country, getting potentially serious about defense. Germany is going to spend 2% defense spending. We are going to spend 75 billion euros a year. And Germany just anchored a 100 billion euro budget for big procurement items in the constitution. Let's keep the momentum, and then it might work for capacity to act.
Yes, but 2041 is a very long time. If I thought it was going to be that long before Europe had the ability to defend itself, I'd stay very close to the United States, and I'd take an active interest in what's going on in America's democracy. Kori, you had a two-finger, and then we're going to come right back here to the woman sort of closer to the door.
Claudia already made the point I was going to better than I could have.
Okay, right back here. And if you say your name, if you stand up, say your name and your affiliation, please. Yeah, exactly. And yeah. Yes. Oh. Never mind, never mind. We're breaking glasses, but it's a time for
You
breaking
didn't
glasses.
say break a glass, but I did that too. Hi, I'm Elena Lazar. I'm an associate fellow at the Chatham House, and I also head the External Policies Unit at EPRS, the European Parliament's Research Service. Thank you very much for this conversation. I want to ask a bit more about China. I think it's been alluded to, but the language on China in the EU Strategic Compass and the transmitted new U.S. national defense strategy that the DoD transmitted to Congress is very different language. I mean, it's really quite far apart. So I wondered how the speakers see this developing in the future as an issue in transatlantic relations. Perhaps if you could make a comment on the EU-US-China high-level dialogue Wendy Sherman and Stefano Sannino have been having for the past couple of years, but also what will this mean for the way that China is discussed and included in the next NATO strategic concept that we expect to come out soon. So that would be really interesting to hear about. Thank you.
Excellent question, not surprisingly from one of our associate fellows. I'm going to take two questions, if you in the front row.
Thanks very much. Shashank Joshi from The Economist. Thank you for a very stimulating panel. I just want to ask about longer-term relations with Russia. Claudia, you said sort of the sense that everything has changed for now. I did also notice President Macron in Kiev, even while pledging substantial support, said geography is stubborn. When you look at it at the end of the day, Russia will still be there. And that's not an isolated sentiment to France. You see that in a lot of places. So I just want to ask, if this does turn into a stalemate in which Ukraine is not able to reverse Russian gains, debates over a rapprochement with Russia, or at least engagement with Russia, will revive. And that debate is going to hang over the NATO summit next week. We've all agreed Russia is a threat, but there is disagreement as to whether it's an irredeemable threat or whether at some stage these bridges need to be built and how quickly. So could you give me a sense of what these debates look like in France, Germany, and the United States, and whether you think these will favor the Kremlin's view that they can outlast us in a war of attrition and eventually force us into a kind of engagement again?
I'm actually going to take one more from the woman in the middle with her hand very stretched high. And then each of you can choose one question. Please don't answer every question, too.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting and stimulating debate.
And say your name, please.
Sorry, my name is Anastasia Halushka. I am from the International Center for Policy Studies in Kiev, Ukraine. I've just myself come from the Donbass area to attend this conference. And a specific comment or a specific question that I wanted to make, thanks to Kori, Schake, thank you so much for your interesting comments. But what I really was focusing on was the moment that you said that we're sending weapons to Ukraine as fast as we can, as fast as we can teach them. I've just been in the Donbass. I know that the weapons that they are being promised, we have a lot of difficulty trying to track them and find them on the ground. For every missile that Ukraine sends to Russian troops, we get 20 back. And the frustration that Ukrainian troops are having is becoming like very sensible to the point of we're getting all these promises, but the implementation on the ground doesn't seem to take place. And as much as you're defending the American policy, saying that we're doing the best we can, there is an enormous amount of aid coming in. What I want to ask is that is it not a bit of a shame that it took 3 months of war and Ukraine basically badgering the US and actually the EU as well for foreign aid and for missile and for the supply of weaponry, of heavy weaponry, for the US to eventually allow in the big guns, which are necessary. We're driving around with Book 1s from 50 years ago with half the missiles still intact, half the missiles missing. And it is going to be another 2 very bloody months in the Donbass area before the weapons that we have been promised from the US are coming in, our people are being trained, these weapons are sent to the front, and these 2 months are going to lead to certain military advances for Russia that we possibly aren't going to be able to reverse anymore. So I want to know from your side, do you think that there's a lesson for the US and maybe the EU as well to be learned from this kind of situation?
Thank you, and thank you for coming to the conference. It's good to have you here.
So I think there are lessons for everybody to learn from this. The lesson from the United States is helping friendly countries have the ability to defend themselves before they're attacked is actually the right way to do it. There are lessons for Ukraine, which is you too could have better prepared better armed yourselves, made yourselves better candidates for closer relations with the West, tackling the corruption problems in Ukraine, for example. And absolutely there are lessons for the Russians, which is they have a military that is getting fought to a standstill by Ukraine all by itself, which means that if Russia had ambitions to attack a NATO country, they would lose even faster against the combined efforts of the allies. So I think there are lessons for all of us. I do grieve, as you grieve, that we didn't do more sooner for Ukraine, and that even now, governments, including my own, are having finely balanced discussions about how much, how fast, and I worry that we are giving Ukraine just enough help to keep fighting and not enough help to cut the artery of Russia's aggression, which is what our ambition should be.
Kori, I'm going to let you talk about China, but I'm first going to come to this side. Timothy, Garton, I don't know which you would like to try.
One sentence on China. The danger of, although the analysis between the US and Europe has converged on China, the danger of a divergence is still there, particularly so long as Germany and some other European countries have a business model which has depended on cheap fossil fuels from Russia and exports to China. So part of the answer is, do we find a different business model? If I may cheat and quickly take Shashank's thing on Russia. Shashank, the policy we need, so long as Vladimir Putin is in power in Russia, can be summarized in 3 words. Contain, communicate, wait. You're the expert on containment. We have to do a much better job communicating both to the Russian people that our quarrel is with Putin and not with Pushkin, not with Russia as such, but also to the global south, where we are absolutely losing the global war of narratives, even in the world's largest democracy, India, when you say, hey guys, this is a war of recolonization, Ukraine is fighting a war of independence. That has, as you know, absolutely no resonance in India. So communicate better and wait. And here's the problem. Politicians find it very difficult to wait. And so I think there will be far too much of a temptation, and here I think Macron is vulnerable, I don't know if you'd agree, to go too quickly to the necessary long-term negotiation with Russia.
Thank you to Timothy Garton for reminding us about the rest of the world. I think the combination of COVID and the war in Ukraine have brought us right back into a relatively small geographical territory for the conversations that we have, much to the detriment of Europe and the United States in the current medium and long run. Christine and then Claudia.
Maybe if I may try and answer about Russia, as indeed it has been an issue that Macron would keep trying to make France the necessary mediator, so to speak, too early, at the wrong time, and then would keep using the same vocabulary, although now, of course, no more reference to that. It will indeed be interesting to see whether at the NATO summit in Madrid, the goals of this war, which the Ukrainians are actually fighting for us, will be spelled out. And my assumption would be that once again, most allies will try and escape answering the question, especially European allies, short, of course, of Poland and the Baltic states. But there is a great unease, and indeed Mario Draghi is in difficulties this very day, because internally the political situation varies from one country to the other. As far as France is concerned, both the far right and the far left, for obvious reasons, have tried desperately not to make any allusion whatsoever to that issue in the legislative campaign we've just come out of. And so my prediction is that Le Pen will try and behave very respectably in the House and show a sense of responsibility when it comes to such important issues. The far left, Mélenchon, will get bored because he doesn't even sit in the assembly, but I don't think he will pick up that issue either. So that's as far as the French conversation, if you will, is concerned.
So Claudia, and we'll take one more round, and we'll come right back, and we'll do all of that in 5 minutes. So,
Oh, okay. Russia. If we want to have a stable security order in Europe, even against Russia, not longer with Russia, but against Russia, it whether requires common principles, we don't have it, or it requires that we agree on certain basic rules. We don't need to like each other, but we accept certain basic rules. Cold War, we don't have that either. Or you have a limited level of trust, which we don't have either. That means for the foreseeable future, we will not have a stable, reliable, predictable security order in Europe, particularly also because some helping elements like arms control treaties and all that are literally all gone. So mentally for us, that means getting ready for a far less stable future. In Germany, it took us a while to get there, but now there is, at least on the government level, a clear understanding that the end of the war defines the peace. So that negotiations one day will take place on the basis of the military reality on the ground, and this is why we have to deliver weapons. Not an easy thing to do for Germany, to deliver weapons in a war area. So that is clear, so we have to help the Ukrainians to get in the best possible position. But I think what is also clear is that we will not have anytime soon any dialogue with Russia, because dialogue implies some kind of common basis. What we are going to have is negotiations, where we know one is here and the other is there, and we have to, kind of talk to each other. Last point, because I don't want, you have all followed the news, and the debate in Germany is quite big. There are some public intellectuals or some artists who have been calling for Germany to stop deliver weapons in order to stop the war. And that's the very old, deeply rooted pacifism idea that the worst that could happen to the world is war, which implies that Ukraine had the choice between war and peace, which obviously it doesn't. Ukraine has a choice between war and annihilation. But bringing that in a deeply pacifist society, who has been educated in pacifism for many decades, is not an easy thing. So we have a crash course on security and defense policy in the moment in Germany.
So very quickly, front row, and then this gentleman and the woman right behind him. I'm really sorry to everybody else, but the next panel will definitely ask your question, allow you to speak.
First of all, I must thank the panel for a very thoughtful presentation. But one point that was not brought up, it might have been mentioned almost peripherally, is the whole issue of accountability. Because something rather historic did take place. I put it to you when President Biden called Putin a war criminal, which implied that accountability would take center stage. And with the great, I was left deeply depressed by Timothy Garton's presentation about the US and Europe mightn't hang together. But
very
surely,
succinct.
so there's the question, just to bring it to a conclusion. Surely high-profile accountability measures, still no tribunal on aggression, the naming of alleged war criminals, of which there's plenty of evidence, bringing it right up the stage would remind people what this war is about, and also make a huge contribution to ending impunity. Thank you.
Tough thing to do during the middle of ongoing conflict. Barakat.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Barakat. I'm from Ethiopia, currently studying at SOAS. You were saying that the West is losing the narrative on the war on Ukraine when it comes to the global South and African countries. Is it not better to ask why those African countries and the global South nations are distancing themselves from the Western countries when Russia is attacking or going against the very principle the global South countries have been fighting for, which is sovereignty? Thank you.
Nice point.
Okay, and the woman here, and I'm really sorry to Nick Greenstock and others who really have been waiting, but to you, and then a very, very brief response, and we'll wrap up.
So it's a breath of fresh air to hear reference to the Global South, to communication, to long-term perspective, and to not just effects, but causes. By the way, sorry, Laura Sullivan, We Move Europe. Okay. Just on the causes and the effects, I think we talk a lot about causes, but not root causes. So yes, Putin's aggression, but what's underneath that? And in reference to the attack on Ukraine, to the war in Ukraine, as well as January 6th and everything else, where are the examples around the world, including in the Global South, of leadership that's facilitating a reflection on power, patriarchy, men and guns, and empire?
Thank you. Those are big questions. We're going to take them as long-term, but for the purposes of this panel, rhetorical questions. So just a very quick kind of one-sentence wrap-up, and we'll start with you, Kori, and come down the
Okay. I will circle back to the China question. I am not concerned that Europe and the United States are saying different things about the threat China poses, because it's fabulous. Europe is acknowledging the threats China poses. We are at the start of a process of building Western solidarity, and the motive force for that solidarity is the malign behavior of China. As Espen Barth Eide, the former foreign minister of Norway, said all the way back in 2005, China is not just rising for the United States, China is rising for Europe too. And the nature of that rise is what's driving consensus between the two sides of the Atlantic on this.
Thank you. Claudia?
Totally agreed. China is rising. China is already in Europe. So, and I think one of the lessons we are learning in the moment from the war in Ukraine is to look in a far more conscious way on what is China already doing in Europe, like the university research centers where we try to get the Chinese money out.
Thank you.
And I think that's a key point. What can we learn now from Russia to not make the same mistakes with regard to China? Again, another interesting point on China is, the strategic compass of the EU and the strategic concept of NATO. We have 21 states, or a bit something like that, who are in both organizations. So it would be interesting to say what those two documents, how much they will differ. And if they will differ a lot, we might wonder why. So I think the whole kind of getting clear on China, we are not really there.
I'm going to stop you there.
I stop.
Very sorry. Christine?
Just one word, the narrative. The more and more people are moved by emotions rather than facts, the more authoritarian regimes use their narratives with greater efficiency. I think that's another dimension where we are really lagging behind, and that is true for Europe as well as the United States.
And you wrote about this, which I didn't mention in your most recent book, The Pandemic and the Battle of Narratives, so we will all read that. And to you, Timothy Garton-Ash.
Accountability. Radovan Karadzic is currently serving his life sentence in a British prison, and that's a very great fact and satisfaction. I would love to see the same be true in Ukraine. We need a special tribunal for Ukraine, as we had for former Yugoslavia, but alas, so long as Vladimir Putin remains in power in the Kremlin, the hard fact is that we will have to have some minimal dealings with the war criminal in the Kremlin. Last word to you, sir. Thank you so much for that comment. We have to understand why we are doing so badly with our Western or Northern narrative in the Global South, and that means we have to do something which is very difficult for politicians and academics, which is less speaking and more listening.
And more reading. Thank you so much to everybody, and thank you to the Chatham House tech team for being willing to let this go on in a couple extra minutes.